War, according to the history books, is usually a story told through maps. Glorious battles and brilliant generals, men with eyes like lightning and hands that command like gods. We're taught that history is the tale of great men. Napoleon on horseback, Wellington silent and brooding on a hill, lines of soldiers forming ranks in the mist. But there's something every book leaves out, not because it's unimportant, but because it's just too awkward to bring up. And that is, they all had to poop. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But picture it. You're standing in a muddy field, knee-deep in sludge, with artillery booming in the distance. The guy next to you just got hit, and suddenly your stomach growls. It doesn't care that you're a soldier, or a general, an emperor, or a rookie. It just wants one thing somewhere to let go. War doesn't make time for privacy. There are no cute little portable toilets, no scented toilet paper, no clean water, and absolutely no air fresheners. In many cases, there isn't even time to take off your pants. In a place where gunfire drowns out human voices, that simple human need becomes a survival challenge, a logistical nightmare, and sometimes even a tragedy. You might scoff, write it off as comic relief, but it's not. This is real. A dirty, raw truth that history often avoids. Yet in silence, it's killed more soldiers than bullets ever did. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid, invisible killers, riding waves of human waste, sweeping through trenches camps, and the trembling guts of frightened men. So today, we're flipping the script. No talk of glory, no talk of victory. Today, we talk about poop. From Napoleon to the world wars, from emperors tormented by hemorrhoids to the millions of miserable soldiers crouching over foul-smelling pits called latrines, from freezing mornings with nowhere to go, to pitch-black nights, armed only with a shovel and a shred of hope. Today we step into the quietest, darkest side of war, where humans return to their most fragile biological truth, and where perhaps history itself was sometimes decided. On the toilet. Waterloo, 1815. It was the place where the world watched a giant fall, and perhaps it was also the place where the world never realized that one of the reasons that giant trembled came not from cannon fire, nor from Wellington's strategy, but from something far more human, his gut. Not metaphorically, quite literally. A stomachache. Raw, cramping, humiliatingly human. History, as usual, loves its glorious tales, cavalry charging through the mist, bayonets gleaming under grim skies, blood-stained flags held high. But real history, the kind that hides beneath the cloak of victory, is a mess of gurgling stomachs, clenched guts, and men trying desperately not to soil themselves while holding a majestic posture atop a horse. People have written endlessly about Napoleon's military genius. They forget that on that fateful day at Waterloo, he was unwell. Truly unwell. And not the sort of unwell that means tired or under the weather. This was primal. The kind of sick where you grit your teeth, tighten your lips, clutch the saddle, and pray to God you don't quite literally blow up in front of your aides. And we don't just know this from rumour. We know it from accounts by those closest to him. That day, Napoleon couldn't stay in the saddle for long. He kept having to dismount. His eyes were sunken, his face strained. Maybe it was hemorrhoids, maybe dysentery, maybe the foie gras from the night before. Some say it was his habit of drinking strong alcohol before battle to warm the belly. But one thing no one disputes: his gut betrayed him on the very day history was waiting to write his name one last time. Just imagine it, an empire of millions, all of Europe, trembling beneath his iron heel, and the man himself desperately looking for a bush. There's a quiet absurdity in that image. A man who once crowned himself emperor rather than kneel before the Pope, now unable to control the most basic human need. There is something deeply human, deeply cruel, and deeply real in that. Some historians even whisper that Napoleon's judgment that day was clouded not by pride or miscalculation, but by pain. Orders delayed. The morning fog, which should have been an advantage, lifted while he hesitated. The British under Wellington gained time to regroup. Time in war is more precious than gunpowder, but it is also the easiest thing to lose, especially when your intestines are screaming. And then it rained. Rain, the silent enemy of generals, and the comrade of soldiers with diarrhea. The earth turned to mud. Artillery got stuck, soldiers slipped, horses panicked, and the hastily dug latrines behind the tents, slick, overflowing, nightmarish, became their own little hell. Picture yourself a French soldier dodging cannonballs one moment, then desperately trying to relieve yourself in a pit of sludge and groans the next. Soldiers don't just die from bullets. They die from filth, from infection, from dehydration, from all the disgusting invisible things no historian wants to carve into monuments. But they happen far more than the gallant battles. And that is what makes Napoleon's stomach ache symbolic. It reminds us that the titans we cast in bronze are made of flesh. They have guts, they have stomachs, they have good days, and bad ones. There's a little-known anecdote that just before the battle, Napoleon requested to remain in his tent longer than usual, not to plan, but because he was curled up gripping his belly drenched in sweat. Perhaps in that moment, he wasn't hoping to defeat Wellington, just hoping not to stink in front of Marshal Ney. A humble wish. Of course, the history books don't have a chapter called Trouble. No one builds statues honouring a man's ability to hold it in under pressure. But real history, the kind you hear only when your ear is pressed close to the dirt, knows how important such things are. A bad decision, a delayed order, a misaimed cannon, all might come down to a stomach in revolt. And when the French flag fell, when Napoleon abdicated for the second time, when he was exiled to St. Helena, perhaps in his loneliest moments, he remembered his gut. The gut that once conquered half of Europe, and then one cold, rainy morning at Waterloo turned against him. War in the End is not an epic poem. It is a swamp of feces, sweat and blood. And in that swamp, even an emperor can slip not from a bullet, but from a stomachache. That was Waterloo. And that's why in Shadow Historians we begin our story with a bowel movement. No one tells you this in history class, that hundreds of thousands of men once marched across the fields of Europe with rifles, boots, cannons, flags and drums, but not a single toilet in tow. For centuries, armies, those great symbols of order, discipline and power, have remained utterly clueless when it comes to one simple thing: poop. See, when people paint war, they paint elite troops in perfect formation, flags fluttering, heroic horses charging through smoke-filled battlefields. No one paints 300 soldiers crouched behind a hedgerow at dawn, quietly trying to take a dump. No one tells you that after every overnight march, there was always a vanguard, not to scout for mines, but to find a place for the entire battalion to relieve themselves. And absolutely no one ever mentions the logistical nightmare that haunted every quartermaster's mind: how many holes for how many butts. The history of war is also the history of human waste. There's no shame in admitting it. If you command an army of 100,000, you're not just facing a logistical hell of bullets and bread. You're staring down a tidal wave of feces, urine, used cloth, and during crisis, agonized moans from roadside bushes. There's an inescapable rule of numbers: for every 100 soldiers, at least 10 are dealing with some level of diarrhea. And war, cruel as ever, comes hand in hand with spoiled rations, dirty water, and intestinal infections. Add to that the stress, the gunfire, the freezing rain, wet socks, and you've got the perfect recipe for a full-blown gastrointestinal disaster. There were no toilets in Napoleon's army. None in the German forces. The British army during the Victorian era, still no toilets. The closest thing they had was a shovel, and sometimes a few nameless soldiers assigned to dig holes. These were the unsung sanitation engineers, the anonymous architects of poop, the ones who knew dig in the wrong direction, and the whole camp would choke on its own stench. While generals discussed geopolitics and troop movements, soldiers debated where the wind would carry the smell. In a time before toilet paper and sewage systems, soldiers had to improvise with anything at hand: a leaf, a newspaper, a scrap of cloth. Some used dry grass. Some, tragically, their bare hands. And if your hands were dirty and the camp had no soap, you can begin to understand why dysentery spread faster than news of victory. Remember the Crimean War. It's often cited as one of the greatest logistical failures of the 19th century, but few mention that in just the first few months, over 10,000 British soldiers died not from bullets, but from intestinal infections. The main reason latrines were dug too close to water wells. That's right. Soldiers were shitting and drawing drinking water just steps apart. It wasn't a war crime, it was a digestive disaster. And it wasn't just the grunts. Officers pooped too, generals too. If you were a captain, you might be lucky enough to have a wooden stool with a hole carried by your men. If you were a general, oh, you might have your own comfort tent where your excrement was practically treated like noble waste. But curtains and cloth couldn't change what it was. And when it rained, the stench still drifted through the air, curled around the trees, and settled gently over the rations. There's a small legend never taught in textbooks that in every military march, at least one soldier pooped on the road. Not out of disobedience, just pure necessity. Maybe it was last night's cabbage soup. Maybe it was that salted fish gone bad. And so, scattered along the muddy trails of victory, there were countless piles of poop, silent, anonymous, but undeniably part of war. Have you ever wondered, in every night assault, was there at least one soldier, running while clenching? And if he couldn't hold it in, what then? Some just kept firing and hoped no one noticed. Some tragically slipped on what their comrades had left behind. Some were wounded, and the last thing they did before passing out was soil themselves. Not out of weakness, but because the human body is hardwired to let go before it dies. But perhaps the most shining example in military history of solving the poop problem came from ancient Rome. The Roman legions, renowned for their discipline and organization, had something it took later armies thousands of years to figure out: the military latrine. Long trenches with roofs drainage and positioned with the wind. Why? Because they understood a healthy soldier starts with a healthy gut. You can't carry a shield if your belly's churning. And a camp that stinks breeds unrest. So yes, war is not just a battle of wills. It's also a battle with bowel movements. A good officer doesn't just command troops, he makes sure his men poop at the right time in the right place. It's not noble. It's just real. And today, when you step into a modern toilet with scented paper soap and a fan bow your head for the soldiers who once died in pain, because they didn't have the very porcelain seat you're sitting on. Because in thousands of years of history, nothing has made people suffer more than that seemingly simple basic need. In the end, war is not about glory. It's a long series of decisions: shoot, run, lie down, and relieve yourself. And among those decisions, the one that might just save your life is finding the right place to take a crap. If you listen closely, really closely, to the epic tales of the American Civil War, where Abraham Lincoln, Robert E. Lee, and Ulysses S. Grant emerge with solemn faces and neatly buttoned grey or blue coats, you'll hear another sound. Not gunfire, not the battle cries of charging soldiers, but a rumble, a gurgle, a stomach growl, a low trembling sound spreading through thin canvas tents like a whisper from death itself. Because when you cram hundreds of thousands of men into military camps, feed them salted meat and hardtack, and let them drink straight from unfiltered rivers, you don't need cannon fire to start the casualties. You just have to wait for their guts to rebel, and rebel they did. The American Civil War quite literally was a war drowned in shit. Of all the soldiers who died, nearly 2/3 didn't fall to bullets. They died from softer enemies: dysentery, typhoid fever, chronic diarrhea. There was nothing romantic about it. No heroic last stand under the beating of war drums. Just a soldier lying on a stretcher body, shaking eyes, rolled back bowels, voiding uncontrollably, and a field doctor shaking his head, another one. The real horror of war wasn't at the front lines. It was in the latrines. Or more accurately, where there were no latrines. Neither the Union nor the Confederacy had much understanding of basic sanitation. They dug a few shallow pits, tossed some leaves over them, and called them latrines. When it rained, everything flowed everywhere. At a Union camp near the Rappahannock River, one flood carried feces straight into the field kitchen. The next morning, the entire regiment came down with diarrhea. Why? Because people thought war was about guns and glory. But they forgot that the colon has a voice too. And when it speaks, It screams. Violently. Picture a morning in 1863. The sky still dim. Soldiers brushing their teeth with charcoal ash. A 17-year-old boy from Pennsylvania rises from his blanket with a familiar gut ache. He doesn't have time to put on his boots, just runs behind the tent. No toilet, just bushes and hope. When he returns, his hands are trembling. Sweat is beading on the back of his neck. 2 days later, he's on a stretcher, eyes rolled white. His name was never written in the history books, but his death, along with tens of thousands of others, was what truly shaped this war. There's a surviving letter from a Union Army doctor to his wife. We lost 40 men this week. Not to bullets, but to their bowels. There is feces everywhere. In the tents outside, the tents under the sickbeds. It smells like hell grew a mouth. The paper is yellowed now, the ink smudged, whether by tears or something else, no one can be sure. Some stories say soldiers started to believe in superstition, that there was a gut demon, a vengeful spirit hiding in the camp grass, punishing those who snuck food or sipped whiskey. When a young soldier collapsed from dysentery, no one was shocked anymore. They just nodded and whispered, "The demons come." But the truth is, no demon was needed, just bacteria. And this was the 19th century. Pasteur hadn't happened yet. No antibiotics, no disinfectants. Doctors used the same knife to cut meat and slice into intestines. And when intestines burst, the bacteria poured out. And when the bacteria poured out, you didn't need a gun. Just a day, maybe half. And that person was gone. At Andersonville, the Confederate prison camp for Union soldiers' death by dysentery became surreal. Latrines overflowed, flies filled the air, and drinking water was full of feces. One soldier described it like this: "We drank what had killed our brothers. It wasn't war anymore. It was a digestive death camp." Things got so bad that army doctors began noting stop issuing hardtack, increase rice rations, but nothing helped if the water was still filthy and the flies still hummed around dinner. And then came the darkest moments. A soldier too weak from dysentery couldn't make it to the bushes. He soiled himself in the tent. 3 others slept nearby. All were infected. A week later, the tent was silent. Still in their final letters home, these men didn't write about that. They wrote, "I'm fine. All is well," because everyone wanted to hold on to a shred of dignity. No one wanted to be remembered as the one who died from diarrhea. But they did. So many did. War doesn't care about your reasons. It just takes. And in the American Civil War, what took the most lives wasn't the Springfield rifle. It was a microbe hiding in a droplet of water, in a spoonful of stew, on a dirty spoon. Dysentery has no monuments. No gravestone reads, "Fell in battle level 10 diarrhea." But in the true history, the one whispered only among ghosts in the dead of night, it was a silent general. A force no musket could kill. One that surrendered only to toilet paper. Of all the places humanity has ever invented to kill one another, none were as bizarre and inhuman as the trenches of World War I. These weren't battlefields. They were vast sewer systems carved into the earth of Europe, where millions of young men lived, died, rotted, and pooped. Half of them were killed by bullets. The other half died quietly of cold, of disease, of rats the size of cats, and from the holes British soldiers grimly called the wretched hole. War didn't come with toilets. It came with makeshift solutions. And in those flooded trenches where knee-deep mud clung like quicksand, these holes weren't places where you sat down, did your business and moved on. They were places where you stared into the void and wondered if you'd ever climb back out. These latrine trenches were often just shallow side ditches, about 3 feet deep and 10 feet long, quickly dug and barely usable. No door, no roof, no peace of mind, no privacy. Sometimes it was just a plank stretched over a pit. A soldier would squat on the edge pants around his ankles, rifle within arm's reach, always ready to fire mid-defecation, in case of shelling. Not exactly the image you find in history textbooks, but imagine this: A 19-year-old soldier, pale with malaria gut cramping from expired rations, trying to force something out, while artillery screams overhead. He knows any moment a blast might rip him apart, leaving him literally blown out of his pants. And even if he survives, he has to jump up, pull up his trousers, grab his gun, and keep going with shit still smeared on his thighs. War doesn't give you time to wipe. Many soldiers said the most haunting thing wasn't the blood. It was the smell. The ammonia stench of urine, the rot of feces soaked in 3 months of unbroken rain, the stink of trench foot from boots never removed the reek of unburied corpses and their own stench. The rats fattened on human remains, and feces scurried around the latrines like tiny grim reapers. They'd leap onto your shoulder mid-squat burrow into ration bags, or gnaw on your toes while you slept. You didn't scream. Screaming meant giving away your position. And that meant death. Some soldiers simply chose not to go. They held it in, until their intestines blocked, until their bellies swelled so badly they had to be evacuated from the front lines, not for gunshot wounds, but for constipation. Others used bottles, cans, even the helmets of dead comrades just to relieve themselves. A German soldier once wrote in a letter home, "Here death comes from behind, but the shit's always right in front." That line belongs in history books. At the Somme, at Verdun, at Ypres, millions endured not just rifles and gas, but a quieter, more personal weapon, their own decay. When you haven't bathed, washed your hands, or changed your underwear for weeks, you're no longer human. You're a creature surviving on instinct. Even taking a dump became a survival puzzle. Pick the wrong spot, you die. Pick the right one, you live, to feel the stomach cramps another day. British troops even had their own superstition. Those who pooped through a barrage and lived were considered lucky. They called it the crap of fortune. One French soldier told the story of a comrade who survived a shelling because he happened to be hiding in a latrine pit. They found him 3 hours later, soaked, shaking, but alive. After that word spread, the shithole is the final bomb shelter. Of course, not everyone was lucky. Some slipped and fell in, some suffocated, some got infections, spiked fevers, convulsed, and died on a stretcher. They called it death by shit, a silent death with no medals, no names etched in stone. But it happened far more often than you'd think. In some battalions, over 20% of injuries weren't from combat, but from infections, traced back to the latrines. Historians have long struggled to describe World War I in appropriately epic language. But what they can't capture is how human dignity eroded through the most ordinary things. When you're digging in the mud for toilet paper, when you bite a rat to stop it from stealing your last crumb, when you squat next to your friend's corpse, you're no longer a soldier defending your homeland. You're just a body trying to survive. The wretched hole was where souls left bodies long before bullets hit. Soldiers crawled out of those pits, hunched over, pulling up their pants, and they were never quite the same. Some who returned home said the stench of the trenches followed them for life. Every time it rained, they smelled it again. Every time their stomach hurt, the memories came back. It was a special kind of PTSD trauma from the gut, from the hole, from the whimper of someone taking their final crap under the thunder of shells. And then, like all nightmares, the war ended. But the latrines didn't vanish. They became a silent symbol, not of glory, but of the cost of survival. They were the shadow beneath the war epic, the place where the heroics stopped and the truth began. Where humanity returned to its raw form, a fragile creature leaking, groaning, just hoping not to be blown apart mid-shit. And maybe the only comfort is this: in that hell, where life and death blended with piss and feces, people still told jokes. They joked about crap, about the trench mate whose fart outboomed the artillery, about the lieutenant who fell in and had to wear a dead German's pants, about the sergeant bitten on the arse by a rat while relieving himself. Because if you couldn't laugh in hell, you were already dead. That was World War I from the bottom of the pit. And maybe at the deepest part of every war, we find the same thing: fear, filth, and a man desperately trying not to shit his pants. On those bitterly cold days in the dark trenches of World War I, when the roar of artillery echoed like the drums of judgment, People died for all sorts of reasons. They died from bullets, from bayonets, from poisonous gas slithering through the fog like an invisible snake. But sometimes they died because of a shovel. Not because they were struck with it, but because that shovel was used to dig a latrine. And a latrine, if it was in the wrong place, not deep enough or poorly covered, could kill hundreds silently, slowly, and reeking of rot. That's the kind of thing most war textbooks never tell you. Sanitation throughout the entire history of warfare has been an enemy without a uniform, without a weapon, but deadlier than any battalion of snipers. It didn't charge like cavalry or rainfire like artillery. It crept in through bacteria, through flies, through a single drop of dirty water, scooped from a puddle to make soup. When people imagine a battle, they think of trumpet calls, battle cries, and swords clashing. But if you walk through the rear of a medieval army camp, what you'd smell is something else entirely. The stench of feces, of urine, of unwashed basins, of boots soaked in mud not taken off for 2 weeks. And in that stench disease thrived. The ancient Romans understood this. Their legions dug latrines in formation. They kept drinking water separate from waste. They knew that to keep an empire marching, they had to keep soldiers' guts clean. But over time, that knowledge was forgotten or ignored, and like all forgotten lessons, it came back this time in the bloody mud of modern war. The 19th and early 20th centuries were a strange era. Science had begun to understand germs, but militaries were still playing the game of chance. In the Crimean War, thousands of British soldiers didn't die from Russian bullets, but from dysentery, typhoid, cholera parasites, and even venereal disease from sharing the same cloth to wipe their backsides. The worst part, they died in groups. Quietly. No fanfare, no glory. The problem was simple. War keeps people busy. Not everyone has time to think about how to poop properly. When the alarm sounds, a soldier isn't going to dig a regulation depth hole, carry his little shovel and sprinkle lime. He's going to duck behind the nearest tent in the freezing wind, do his business fast, pull up his pants, and skip the hand washing. And so, on a winter morning, as the whole squad huddles around a pot of porridge, it takes just one unwashed hand stirring the ladle, and everyone's digestive system begins a slow march into hell. By World War I, this became a disaster on an industrial scale. In trenches stretching hundreds of kilometers across France and Belgium, millions of men lived, ate, slept, fought and relieved themselves just meters apart. Makeshift latrines called latrine trenches lined the edges of the dugouts. Some were covered with planks, others weren't. When it rained, floodwater would overflow the pits and carry waste right back into the soldiers' shelters. At those moments, the stench wasn't just a smell, it was a nightmare seeping into every pore. Soldiers learned to tell which latrine was barely tolerable and which one was a death trap. Some relieved themselves into bags and tossed them away in the dark. Some used buckets. Some held it in. Some took laxatives just to get it over with. Others gave up and let it happen in their pants. They were filthy anyway. You won't see this in war movies. No dramatic lighting will highlight 3 soldiers taking turns squatting by a crumbling dirt wall, explosions rumbling in the distance. But that was reality. And that ugly, filthy reality explains a lot about exhaustion breakdown and the spirit of the troops. Why does a unit collapse after just a few days of holding out? Maybe they're hungry. Maybe they've lost contact. Or maybe they just can't find a safe place to go. If you can't release properly, literally, it's hard to fight properly. Logistics in war isn't just about moving bullets. It's about managing human waste. When American troops joined WW1, one of their greatest innovations wasn't the machine gun, it was the sanitation system. They brought lime disinfectants, latrine construction protocols, and hand-washing routines. Medical units didn't just treat the sick, they inspected toilets. One commander reportedly said, "I know which unit is about to fall apart just by the smell of their camp." Gross, absolutely, but accurate. On the Italian-Austrian front mountain, troops had to relieve themselves in 20°C weather. Faces froze to the cliffs. Then came spring, the ice melted. The runoff from the mountains didn't just bring snow, it brought back the memories of long-digested meals. And then came a dysentery outbreak that wiped out an entire brigade. In the end, when the death toll of a war is counted, people talk about bullets, grenades, gas. Rarely does anyone mention the germs from a toilet. It doesn't explode. It doesn't scream. It just quietly drains the strength from every soldier gut by gut, stomach by stomach, until the whole fighting force is hollowed out. Sanitation, quiet and unseen, is the most silent battle in every war, and in many cases it's the one that decides everything. If you want to understand a civilization, you can look at its art, its philosophy, its grand declarations, or you can step into its army's toilet. The deeper you go underground, where feces, urine and urgency intersect, the clearer you see the true face of war. Not the glory, not the flags, but the raw, unfiltered instinct to survive. A toilet in wartime isn't just a place to relieve yourself. It's where a soldier remembers they're still human, and sometimes it's the perfect place for a quiet little idea to emerge. In the trenches of World War I, amid the roar of artillery, the screams and the sticky scent of blood, one thing quietly shaped the soldiers' experience: the toilet. Except, it wasn't anything like what you're thinking. No gleaming tiles, no soft minty toilet paper. Just a pit in the ground, a few makeshift planks, or worse, a rusty bucket, passed hand to hand in helpless silence. They called it the thunderbox, because if an artillery shell hit it, it could explode. One soldier even joked, "One shell to the thunderbox, and I'll die like a Roman emperor in mid-shit." There's something absurd, yet deeply real, in that joke. Because in war, life and death aren't decided by speeches, they're decided by your bowels. A soldier with diarrhea in the middle of a battle can't hold a rifle. An army without sanitation won't last long before disease takes over. No military strategist draws latrine lines on a map, but they exist, and sometimes they decide the fate of an entire front. Don't forget, the First World War didn't just happen on land. It happened in guts, in intestines, in the anxiety of wondering, can I dig a deep enough hole before the enemy fires? That tension turned the toilet into the last refuge of thought, not lofty philosophy, but the philosophy of survival. In the middle of explosions, a soldier thought a lot about where to shit. And in that moment of squatting, staring into a dark hole, he might realize war isn't a battle between good and evil. It's a contest to see who can control their digestive system better. There's a story recorded by a Canadian private. He recalled that every morning before dawn, he and his squad would sneak behind the trench to take care of business. One kept watch, one dug. They called it the sacred hour. No one spoke much, because everyone knew one sound, one flicker of light, and the enemy would know exactly where they were, and then the shithole would become a grave. But strangely enough, it was during that hour they felt closer to each other than anywhere else. No ranks, no titles, just human smells, shared embarrassment, and the shivers of a Flanders morning. In a way, the toilet became the only truly equal place in the army. A colonel and a grunt, squatting over the same hole, shared the same worry. Did I bring enough paper? No one is above anyone else when the shit drops. And in that instant, war gets stripped of all its artificial ideals. It's no longer about honor or country or divine missions. It's just the story of individuals trying to survive today with sweat shivers and stench. If there's one place where real thought was born during wartime, it was probably in the toilet. Some soldiers admitted they only really reflected on life while crouching over a hole. Not because they liked being philosophical at that moment, but because it was the only time they were truly alone. No shouting, no orders, no eyes watching. Just them, their guts, and the cold emptiness of a hastily dug pit. That's when a soldier starts to ask, why am I here? What am I fighting for? Are those Germans over there pooping like me? Maybe the first seeds of peace begin with the question, is my enemy constipated too? In that strange moment of empathy, the soldier realizes we all have an anus, We all stink if we don't wash. And maybe, we're all just trying to survive the same way. In 1917, during a major British offensive near Ypres, an entire platoon was wiped out, not by bullets, but by dysentery. The latrine was too close to the drinking water. Feces seeped in. A week later, the whole unit was down. No rifle could save them. It was the toilet, or more precisely, the lack of one that killed them. A silent death. No bugles, no gravestones, just twisting guts, an unquenchable thirst. When the war ended, they built monuments. They engraved the names of generals of battles. No one engraved the holes. But if there's one thing that sets modern war apart from ancient war, it's the understanding that sanitation is just as vital as ammunition. Napoleon once said, "An army marches on its stomach," but he forgot to add, it also marches on its ass. A toilet in war isn't just a hole in the ground, it's a witness. A place where memory stays messy, crude, but true. And like every other part of history, it deserves to be told with all the shit, the piss, and yes, even the ideas. Because if war is hell, then the toilet in war is the dungeon beneath that hell. And in that darkness, sometimes a tiny idea can sprout quietly, foul-smelling, but alive. One day long after humans have gone extinct and giant cockroaches rule the earth, they might stumble upon the remnants of an ancient civilization. Amid the rubble of collapsed concrete and charred circuit boards, they'll uncover a strange object white round with a lid and a glowing button. And just as we once puzzled over the bizarre statues of the Sumerians, the cockroaches will ask themselves, what was this thing used for? And if they're smart enough to decode the leftover data stored in derelict satellites, perhaps they'll tilt their heads, scratch their antennae and say, "Ah, so this was the true throne of mankind. The modern toilet, it's where technology meets biology in a strange unspoken pact. What began as a hole in the ground has evolved into porcelain machines that can spray warm play music and clean with water pressure calibrated down to the millimeter. Some emit a gentle glow at night as if they know you're tired and just want a quiet moment. Some even have Wi-Fi. Some analyze your urine and warn you about early signs of diabetes. You can say, "I need to use the bathroom," and the toilet will respond, "I've been waiting for you." But the journey here wasn't a clean one. It began in the sewers of ancient Rome, moved through the damp wooden chamber pots of the Middle Ages, and reached the ammonia-soaked public lavatories of Victorian times. Just a few centuries ago, relieving yourself was still a public act, loud, smelly, and deeply human. No lids, no doors, just people and poop. In the time of Louis XIV, nobility could chat casually while doing their business without shame. A countess might squat in the middle of a drawing room, perched on a fine porcelain bowl with Chinese patterns, and still be mid-conversation about fashion. Privacy as we understand it today is a very recent invention, and the modern toilet is its shining monument. The 19th century brought a sanitation revolution. London stank so badly that Parliament had to suspend sessions. And from that crisis emerged the irresistible idea clean water could wash away all sins, both literal and metaphorical. The flush toilet was born, not because people suddenly cared about hygiene, but because society couldn't stand the stench anymore. It was a revolution sparked by the nose. And then came Japan, always taking things further. There the toilet isn't just a place to relieve yourself, it's a philosophy, an experience. You walk in and the lid opens automatically to greet you. The seat is already warm. Gentle stream sounds start playing. Then a smart nozzle softly cleans the places you'd never dare mention in poetry. When you stand the toilet, thanks you. It flushes, deodorizes, disinfects, and closes its lid with a respectful bow. In that moment, you are no longer just a creature of excretion. You are the honored guest of a digital ritual. But behind all this comfort lies a troubling question. Why do we use liters of clean, drinkable water, something millions of people in the world lack, just to wash away our waste? The modern toilet, for all its luxury and lavender scent, is an ecological paradox. A standard American toilet uses 1.6 to 3.4 gallons, 6 to 13 liters of water per flush. In some parts of Africa, that's the daily water supply for a family of 5. And then there's toilet paper. The paper industry consumes millions of trees every year just to provide something we use for 15 seconds and flush away. Ancient people used shell stones or wooden sticks. The Chinese Tang dynasty invented toilet paper as early as the 6th century, but it wasn't until the modern age that the butt-wiping industry truly bloomed. Ironically, we now distinguish toilet paper by class 2-ply for the common folk, 3-ply for the middle class, and 5-ply for those who believe their butthole is a national treasure. Technology has even suggested we skip paper altogether. In some countries, toilets now come with built-in washers and dryers with temperature settings that change with the seasons. Some call them smart toilets, but maybe a better term is empathetic toilets. They understand you, care for you, and don't judge. A place where you can be naked, vulnerable, embarrassed, and still be gently embraced. So what's next? Perhaps bio-toilets turning waste into energy. Maybe AI-powered commodes that analyze your poop and diagnose illnesses. Maybe one day when we live on Mars, the toilet will be the first device we install after the sleeping pod. Because whether you're an emperor, a foot soldier, or an astronaut, you still need a place to simply be yourself. And there's no place more honest than a toilet. Technology may take us to the stars, but the toilet keeps us grounded, fragile, chaotic, and utterly human. Maybe if there's one true sign of civilization, it's our ability to create a soft, dignified place to take a dump and to call it a basic human right. History is often told through battles, treaties, cold stone statues, and grim death tolls. But if you listen closely, if you dare to look down all the way into the dirt to where small holes were dug behind the barracks, you'll find another kind of history. A history of midnight stomach cramps, whispered conversations at the latrine, frantic footsteps through artillery fire, just to find a place to relieve the pressure. A deeply human history, raw, crude, and because of that, profoundly real. From Napoleon doubled over with stomach pain at Waterloo to World War I, soldiers limping through seas of mud and poison gas, while clutching their bellies, pooping something we usually consider private. Trivial, even shameful, suddenly appears as a quiet yet ruthless force in the course of history. You can't command an army if you're nauseated with gut pain. You can't fight effectively if you're dehydrated from diarrhea. You can't hold the line if every time the shelling stops, your soldiers run for cover, not from bullets, but to find a private place to go. You won't find these things in textbooks because they stink, but that doesn't make them any less important than the most heroic battle. In fact, many wars didn't fall for lack of guns, but for lack of toilets. It's no coincidence that the Roman army had an entire engineering unit dedicated to building latrines. It's no coincidence that the Germans in World War I meticulously studied how to dig drainage ditches around their latrines to prevent disease. And it's certainly no coincidence that modern generals rely on logistics experts just to ensure that troops can poop properly at the right place at the right time. Imagine for a moment if Napoleon had had an effective dysentery pill, would Waterloo have turned out differently? If the trenches in World War I had been kept cleaner and drier, could hundreds of thousands of soldiers have been spared death by dysentery, typhoid, or exhaustion? We'll never know for sure. But what we do know is this feces and how humans deal with it has had a very real impact on the map of the world. There's something strangely ironic, even absurd, in the idea that an empire could teeter because of a stomachache. That power strategy and willpower can all be humbled by one simple biological need. Maybe that's the quiet lesson history keeps whispering in our ears, the one we pretend not to hear. That strength doesn't lie only in swords and guns, but also in guts. That sometimes a clean latrine can save more lives than a grand counter-offensive. So if you're sitting here listening to this video in a warm room with a bathroom just a few steps away, appreciate it. Know that soldiers have died trying to go to the toilet. That generals have lost entire battles because they couldn't control their stomachs. And that some of the most glorious chapters in history are in truth just fragments of stomachaches retold with cannon fire. Don't underestimate the power of a good poop. Because somewhere in a parallel universe, if Napoleon's bowels had been just a bit stronger, all of Europe might be speaking French right now, and we'd be calling the bathroom La Toilette Impériale.